Mike, thanks so much for joining me. And
Very nice to be here.
we're going to be talking about getting through this current situation thanks to the comforts, I suppose, of film and media, although I think we might stray from that somewhat because we don't particularly want to spend all of our time talking about a virus that we've heard about for the last 2 months.
No.
But let's kind of start with where we currently are, do you think, in terms of we're in lockdown, productions are maybe somewhat happening, and we've spent 2 months living off Netflix or whatever
We
there
spent
is.
2 months living off our televisions. That's what it is. I mean, the great winner in all of this is television. And the repeats of television, and to use our conversation of earlier, how many times can you repeat Dad's Army? Well, as far as I'm concerned, forever. We'd be absolutely banjaxed without television. For instance, the BBC is beginning to make shows that are appropriate to the circumstances in which we are. In other words, only individuals appearing to be in the same headspace, but actually not.
So have you seen things like Have I Got News For You, where they've been doing that, and those kinds of
Have I Got News
setups?
For You really disappointing, because there was so much interplay between those kind of 5 characters. And you can feel the sort of stiffness in it. But there are some little kind of drama things, like we were talking earlier about W1A, has done a version of that show, which was always very funny. Has done a version of that show applied to lockdown, where they decide, I gather, simply once you've finished a repeat it.
You start it again.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's the best way to fill the schedule. They're going to repeat the entire 2012 Olympics because everyone liked that. So.
I found myself watching a show the other night which was a cup final from 1947. Just extraordinary.
Is this, though, getting us through the lockdown, or is it just something to fill the space?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I think it is getting us through the lockdown, but I also think that what will happen is that there are 2 huge factors which people will learn from these circumstances and will apply to every day. One is that you're going to have to find different ways of telling stories, and the monologue, in whatever form it may be, and it won't just be a monologue, is going to be very important, because of course it is just one guy in a room playing to a phone. The other thing is money. Which will be, I'm sure, hugely influential. And people will feel that there's no reason why this should not be a cheaper road to cheaper production. And I'm working on a film at the moment with a very inventive producer. It's a film about the early days of the atomic energy, or it sounds dry as dust, but it isn't. It's absolutely great. And the making of the British atom bomb. Of course, the all of those original facilities, they had simply, this was 1947, 1948, they'd taken over RAF bases, which had become redundant after the war. And so what we said was, well, where is there an RAF base? Well, there's an RAF base just outside Cambridge, where the War Museum has its air...
Duxford.
Duxford. right? Well, Duxford is a time warp. It's absolutely 1940. All the buildings are 1947, and not only do they have some of the aircraft that we need there, but also they have these buildings. And so the producer said to me, "Look, what we'll do is I'm going to phone them this morning, and I'm going to put to them this deal that." We're going to make the whole of our film here, because not only have they got a B-29, which is what we need, which dropped, but they've got, but it looks like all those original facilities. And what we'll do is we'll say we're going to move an enormous number of caravans in here where people will live for the whole run of the production. They will not be allowed outside the main gate. We will have policemen and God
your
knows
own
what
mini
kind.
isolated crew.
And there will be a whole new life that will happen at Duxford over a period of about 3 months. And he phoned them and they said yes.
Great.
They absolutely snatched his hands off for it. Now, you know, people will go, if we think that lockdown has been a pain in the ass, then good boys, after about 4 weeks, that is, people are going to be climbing the walls, people are going to be breaking out. It'll be Steve McQueen time. But nonetheless, it might get it made, and it might get get over the great factor in trying to make a film in the normal way with the normal perspectives and the big lesson that a movie needs to take you somewhere you haven't been before. The thing that is most difficult about that is insurance. It's not even aesthetics and stuff like that. It's just insurance. How are you going to insure 90 people for the length of time that you well, if you put them in jail, as it gets
you rather limit the factors of what could possibly go wrong.
It may be that you've made that whole problem much better. So it needs must when the devil drives, and I think that it's very interesting that these things, which are beginning to pop up, like the W1A show on the BBC, they're talking about running the proms, running the last 6 weeks of the proms. What on earth is the Albert Hall going to look like with nobody in it? But there we are. And so there will be these things that will start to sprout.
Right. And do you think this then might form a blueprint for how we do things in the future, even after lockdown or
has gone?
Yeah,
it's there are bound to be lessons. They're just bound to be lessons that are valuable. Where people say, "But look, we did it that way during the lockdown. Why shouldn't we do it that way now? Why do you have to have 2 people on either side of a 2-shot? Why don't we have a stand-in and just the actor? And then you can get rid of Tom Cruise in 7 days, pay him that much less. Whoa, that's good. That will be the kind of lesson that people will learn from this. So I'm sure that there will be. And I'm also sure that there will be proper aesthetic lessons to be learned, because there will be forms which will present themselves and look like solutions, will be solutions. That will come out of being forced into these strange byways of production. It's going to depend on the writers. It always depends on the writers. But if the writers can see a way of doing it, then and they will.
So is this an opportunity for writers in particular? Because we've spoken a little bit about how the kind of films that we've been used to in the cinema, big blockbusters, big Marvel films, big effects-based films, are going to be incredibly hard to produce. And maybe this is now a chance for films on smaller, more modest kind of production scale, more original films, maybe, just even two-hander
Sure.
to produce.
Of
now.
course,
Yeah.
of course, that's true. That must be true. However, if you take the what a film should do is to take you somewhere you've never been, which is one of Jerry Bruckheimer's great things. He says, "I'm a show me guy." That's his first principle, and his second is take me somewhere I've never been. Well, one place, of course, that we've never been able to be is we've never been able to be inside the head.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily limit the ambition of the thing. I mean, look at the last chunk of the Kubrick space film.
2001.
2001. That's
The whole sequence after the Stargate.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
I think that those sorts of challenges will lead to very radical solutions. It'll be weird for a bit, but not for very long. People will relearn very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, audiences adapt very fast, really, don't they? They're not as kind of fixed in their ways as people would like to probably think.
Always they are sharper than we think they are.
Yeah.
Always. And one of the wonderful things about the movies is that, which is why people don't understand how people can be satisfied by watching a film on an iPhone, for God's sake. That there is they say that if you monitor the 5 eggs in the box as you put the 6th egg into the boiling water, there is an energy jump spike as the 5 eggs share the little bit of experience of the living thing in the 6th egg that is dying. And there is something like that happens to audiences. The very fact of you being in the same space with other people and experiencing it, and this wonderful, exotic, enormous experience that is being shown to you either in the great big sci-fi epics, or it isn't necessarily just that.
I experienced it in comedy. I went to see Hot Fuzz in the cinema, and there was a moment where the entire audience spontaneously applauded in the middle of the film at one very particularly funny moment of physical comedy. It's where Simon Pegg's character jump kicks a farmer's wife in the face. and she's got this shotgun, she's about to shoot him, and he just doesn't stand for it and leaps through the air and kicks her in the face. And it was just so unexpected and so ridiculous and so beautifully cut and timed and hilarious that the whole audience applauded.
Yes.
And you wouldn't get that experience at home.
You wouldn't get that experience, and somehow or another, I think that will be the biggest challenge. When you think about those classical Greek theatres, the Sophocles theatres, where you've got that huge bowl, and as a background you have the sea, and then you pack 5,000 people into that huge bowl, and you show them Oedipus Rex. Well, of course, that's. That's not Simon Pegg kicking a farmer's wife in the face. That is a deeply revealing human experience, and that's what you'd also lose Simon Pegg. That's a great shame. It's like the audience. Do you remember the audience in The Producers? So up on stage, there is the producer. There are the actors. Don't be dumb, be a smarty, come and join the Nazi party. And the audience
dumbfounded.
I like that. Their mouths are literally well, that's a very revealing thing about how an audience responds to what is being shown, and that you'd have to defend.
Yes.
You'd have to invent around that. I don't know how.
Well, it's an interesting time for film distribution because several films that had cinema releases scheduled during this current time period have gone directly onto streaming services. We've had mostly, I've noticed that they've been family films, I would describe them. Yeah. The Scooby-Doo film and the Trolls World Tour and things like that, which, are also beneficial, the fact that children are at home, parents are at home together, and it's an experience they can have. And maybe you could argue necessarily that these don't need a huge cinema screen release, but then I think part of that shared experience that we have is that parents take their children to the cinema, and then the children grow up and they take their children to the cinema, and that's a part of our culture.
Yes, indeed. And it does have to do with the magnificence of scale, of size. There is something magnificent about a great big screen. I remember again when I saw that Kubrick film that we were talking about it.
2001.
Thank you very much. Seeing it on a screen that was almost semicircular.
The Cinerama.
Right.
Yeah.
Where you actually had to get a shot, you had to pan your head. And that's physical invention, and we are as a species physically very inventive. And so, again, what might happen is that you might have an extraordinary flowering of new technique, which would make things better.
The technology comes in and we use it.
And so, in a sense, this whole thing, what we have been asked to talk about today, this whole thing is a matter of whether you approach it optimistically or pessimistically. And there's something about the business of making this stuff, and the sort of people who are drawn into the making of this stuff, that you'd say had to be optimistic. There's so many difficulties. There's so much that militates against a successful conclusion that it could only be done by optimists. Whether Michael Haneke is an optimist or not, I mean, some of those real grim guys, I don't know, but optimism is a thing that you would recognise when you're picking students.
Yes, that's true. And when we work with students, we set them briefs that have constraints deliberately, because you're having to test them. You're having to say, can you do this under these circumstances? We're now all under constraints as filmmakers. And so, I do think that's an optimistic
maybe
thing.
For it, because it's going to produce stuff,
Yeah, it's going to challenge us to do something different and make things in a way that we haven't had to think about before, perhaps.
I mean, the idea of this guy ringing up Duxford and saying, I've got this idea, and all I need to do is to be able to move 150 caravans into the acres of space that you've got.
Yeah, we're just going to descend a village upon you into the car park.
That's it, you're going to have a village.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's brilliant.
Yeah. And then, I mean, obviously we're talking, you mentioned earlier, financially, it's more cost effective for films to be made. Now, I don't want the only... I don't want
to be ways round that.
Well, I don't want the only winners to be the money guys, because that's very depressing. That's where my optimism drops and things are. So they didn't have to pay Tom Cruise for 2 weeks and they got him for 1. Well, then I'm sure Tom Cruise isn't very happy about that either, because he probably wants...
Yes, that's true enough. On the other hand, if that whole thing got to be more joined the kind of realism by which you and I lead our daily lives, that would be no bad thing.
And so then we're also adapting the way, perhaps, in which we are viewing things because we're not going to cinema. I mean, I don't want us to become a nation, all of us being a nation of goggle boxes.
No.
Where
it's very interesting. There is, and I'm quite certain that this is true, in the process of making a film, there are times when it is very necessary and nobody has to discuss it, everybody knows it instinctually, when what you are producing must be seen on a big screen. And there are other times, probably more of those times, when what you need to do is to analyze what's there and analyze how it works and be very cold, clear about. I don't know whether you've ever heard a comedy writer talk about the construction of a joke, but if you think that anything comes out of one of those conversations which is in the end funny, you're deluding yourself. They are not. They atomize the joke and then put the atoms back together again. And that is how the small screen works. And so when you watch a film of great passion, or for which film you have a great passion, you'll find yourself watching it entirely differently between the experience of the thing on a big screen and an audience with whom you are touching shoulders, which is very, very important. Nobody's ever really analysed how that works. Or the kind of, my God, that's clever, which is something that you get off television.
Yeah.
I was watching yesterday, you know, when people see the DiCaprio film about the Titanic, what's it called?
Titanic.
Thank you very much. They all say, a lot of people say, but you should have seen A Night to Remember. Well, yesterday they were showing A Night to Remember on the movie channel, and I watched it. And in a way, it's true. If what you're doing is making a film about the sinking of the Titanic, then A Night to Remember is very clean and
it meets that brief, doesn't it?
Logic,
yeah.
And it's not that it lacks passion. But of course, what it doesn't have is that great Hollywood efflorescence of, well, what's DiCaprio got to do with the sinking of the Titanic? What's this jewel that they steal? What?
It's all about what's at stake, isn't
what's
it?
All that?
Then, yeah.
But of course, the other thing is that Cameron has this very interesting split attitude towards technology. And what you're watching is the defeat of technology by natural forces.
Yeah.
And the one thing that A Night to Remember doesn't have is that extraordinary thing where the ship splits in two, where it simply breaks its back. In A Night to Remember, it goes down in the approved North Atlantic fashion.
Yes, yeah.
But of course, Cameron says this technology is going to be so unable to deal with the attack of an iceberg that we're actually going to break it utterly. And that's something that you need scale for. And it's interesting that the two movies, they need to be seen together, you know. It's a very interesting comparison.
That's a good double bill.
Sure.
Maybe not the most cheerful.
right.
But yeah, those two approaches. And I mean, the last time I saw Titanic, it was re-released into IMAX.
Yes.
And that was quite an extraordinary experience to sit through as well. And again, we're talking about scale.
Yeah.
Films, when they're made, are often seen the first time round in the cinema, and then the audience doesn't see it in the cinema ever again.
No.
The next time, and the time after, and the time after, they're watching it on a television.
Yeah.
So are we being too precious about
always
about cinemas?
Yes, always. What is a cinema? A cinema is, I mean, it's when you and I knew it, it was full of cigarette smoke.
There was a balcony.
There was a balcony. There was a back row. That was very. The back row was very important. Oh, I love the back row. So there are all of those factors. It's a human experience. In the end, it's a human experience.
You remember the person coming around with the tray?
Oh, the Kiora girl.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's little tubs of ice cream.
That's right. Yes,
chalk ices or something.
Sure.
And a torch to show you where you were going.
Yep.
And, I mean, that's all nostalgia, right? I mean, I love the thought of nostalgia.
It's not just nostalgia, Howard. It is that whatever the experience is, it is a human experience. And, going to the movies now, well, what are the movie houses that we love going to? How are they different from the Kiora girl and the cigarette smoke in the projector beam and all that stuff?
Yeah. You get the better sound. You get the better picture that you have.
A very decent sandwich. You get all sorts of kind of publications and this and that and the other. In other words, what they're saying is just the way in the 1930s they said exactly the same thing. We must give the audience an experience.
Yes.
There must be. It must be going to the movies.
Yeah, and now, I mean, I've been to several midnight releases of major films, tentpole kind of things that are released simultaneously all around the world on the same day, which we'd never had before as well, which is very exciting, because the internet has kind of ruined film going in terms of spoilers and,
Yes, of course, that's why the French, God bless them, or not, are so dedicatedly anti-Netflix, because it takes away that particular bit of the movies, the life experience.
So what do we think cinemas are going to do after this? Because we can't all sit in the same space anymore that the cinema had catered for.
I don't know.
And also I'm concerned that now that several distributors have decided to go straight to TV, some of them are even owned by the same company. That's the thing. Amazon owns Twitch, which is the game streaming video service. In the States, of course, they're about to change the law so that distributors can own cinemas again, which could mean that they completely bypass certain things and they only put it in their cinema.
That's interesting. I'm not sure that's a bad thing.
Do you think it's going to change what ends up in cinemas and what ends up on our screens?
What happens is that, because another thing that might happen is that ups competition, and it doesn't up commercial competition, or not just commercial competition, although it will do that.
Yes.
They will say they rationalized the terminology of it at a certain point in Hollywood, and you were either a major or you could be a mini major. And if that's the case, let's not take this subject to that production entity, because we know they won't like it and they'll mess with it. Let's take it to that entity who will leave it alone and they will like it. Then I think that the kind of beige mush, which is sometimes the colour of a great deal of the stuff that we now are released. We find ourselves watching. That might sharpen that up because selectivity is a very sharp tool, you know.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think we've got the battle of the streaming services and these subscription services that is driving forward new production, and each of them want to have their own flagship series or film or something that makes people want to pay money to have their service above the other choices.
Yes.
And then if we have that idea with the cinemas as well in the future, and that they start really being very choosy about, you know, we're not going to just do general release of everything like it's been done in the past, and they're also being selective about what they screen and what they show.
Yeah.
That could then also drive that quality.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Which I think would be it's not. It's a very visible quality that kind of every 20, 25 years something comes along which forces reinvention. Sound came along. Technicolor came along, and.
Yeah.
You know? And perhaps this is going to happen here, that it will force us into, you know, so what's the subject? Well, if you can't make it about Monument Valley, what's it like inside your head?
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty interesting, you know?
I did an interview with Brian Clemens,
Yes.
who, you know, hugely respected television writer who could churn out scripts of high quality very, very fast. And he told me once he worked for the Danziger brothers.
Yes.
And the Danziger brothers being notorious for being cheap.
Yeah.
And they didn't even have their own studios the time he worked for them. I think they later built their own in Elstree. But they were kind of using other people's studios, and they'd come in and they'd hire a stage which already had a set from the last production in it. And they'd tell Brian, we want you to write a story which has got a ballroom and a submarine, and you know, because that's what they had, and he'd have to do it. And he said it was one of the best things he ever did because it taught him how to be economical as a writer in the stories that he was telling.
I think that's absolutely terrific.
I love that. You know, I think he said it sharpened him up, and I think that's what we're talking about here in a little way.
Yes.
We're saying, you know, you now have to inherit a situation in which you can't do this, that, and the other that you could used to come up with, but you've got this and this instead. Work with it and make something good. You think of all
the kind of great, I totally agree. You think of all the great ideas, moments. The death of Hal.
Yeah.
Daisy, days.
It's incredible, yeah.
Terrible, tragic moments that you go from this super intellect to the early days when it was, and I remember how incredible it was that a computer could sing Daisy, Daisy.
Yeah.
And there he is regressing, just the way my dear old friend, who is going to die any minute now, is intellectually regressing.
Kind of living in a childhood.
Yes.
And, in the past.
And somehow or another, when we talk about mush, when an idea like that, I mean, that whole movie was never Kubrick could never have been mush, but mush is a problem, and
we were talking about repeats of repeats.
yes. And if this situation means that you have to invent, that was a piece of God-given invention, just like Brian Clemens saying, Christ, I've got a boardroom and a submarine, what do I do?
Yeah.
Which I think is...
I mean, how do you show a computer dying? and it's just ingenious, isn't it?
Yes. And ingenuity it's this situation is bound to provoke ingenuity.
I think that's quite a positive note to end on.
Good.
I like that. Mike, thanks ever so much.
All right,
It's been a really interesting talk.